Hello, and welcome to Detailed Infamy. On this podcast, we examine major infamous events in chronological detail, outlining the origins, people, events themselves, and their aftermath. The promise of this program is to bring these events to life from a strictly accurate and apolitical point of view. Thank you. Thank you for listening to my intro. Welcome to part 2 of 3 about the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And episode 2 of all time of the Detailed Infamy podcast. And I just wanted to get some house cleaning stuff out of the way. Part 1 was my first ever podcast. I have no audio engineering background. I'm not a professor of history or anything like that. It's just something I'm really into. I love really getting down in the details of major historical events. And you can expect me to continue doing this podcast as long as I get more than 0 downloads, which I got from the first one. Thank you to those brave souls that tried out a podcast that had 1 episode and clearly wasn't done by a professional. But, part 1 is I didn't really do any intro to the podcast or anything because it was my first one ever, and it's something I've wanted to do for a long time. So I just kind of bared down and did it. And I'm glad I did. It kind of pulled the Band-Aid off, and here we are. I mean, anyone with any kind of audio engineering background can tell that I'm not using the highest end microphone, and I'm not in a recording studio. But I have an okay microphone, and I'm in a quiet office in my basement. I'm going to keep doing it. I really love it. I really enjoyed making the first one. And as long as my download count remains above 0, I'm going to keep doing it. And you can expect more. Part 3 will probably come out within 3 weeks or a month after this. And then I'll move on to a new subject. I've got a few ideas kicking around. At some point, I will do a really long form D-Day and maybe even a whole World War II series. That is just my historical sweet spot, as it were. I'm just very enthralled with the whole war, but that day in general. I think I could do a great podcast about it. But in order to do it the service it deserves, I'm going to wait till I've refined things a little more and maybe a few more people are listening. So with that all out of the way, there will be more to come. Thank you for listening. I have a crappy website up that's really just kind of a billboard staking my claim. Maybe as things progress, I'll do more of that. But thank you. And we'll get into it. And so today we're really going to get down and dirty in the details, minute by minute accounts. And we're going to kind of jump around a little. In that, I'll do one flight for maybe, say 45 minutes of time on that day, and then I'll jump back in time and do another one and kind of bring them all together at the end. It's easier for continuity. It's already a little complicated and hard to follow, so that's the way I'm going to do it. And I just want to warn you that, this is a horrific day. There are, when you get down to it, we're talking about airplanes where some very determined men overtook them by force and violence and flew them into buildings that had thousands of people in them. There's just no way around that. There's no way to sugarcoat that. But it's not like this is super gruesome. I mean, any teenager that's taken basic junior high, middle school level history, can listen to this. I just want to warn you, it gets a little emotional, and the imagery I'm going to describe is a little bit graphic, but it's nothing you can't, read about on Wikipedia. So I will read a lot of direct quotes from people in the thick of it, including the terrorists themselves. And so let's just jump into it. So now, when I left off, all 4 planes had taken off. So let's dive back in. Part 2 of the 9/11 attacks. And we'll start back on American Airlines Flight 11, which is the one that is going to be hijacked by Omar Atta and his group. So this flight's piloted by Captain John Oganowski, First Officer Thomas McGinnis, And let's get into the timeline. So 8:13 a.m. Flight 11 has its last routine communication with the FAA's Boston Center. This is the just kind of basic flight. Hey, we've taken off. Let's go. 16 seconds after that communication, the ATC sends instructions for the pilots to climb to 35,000 feet. And they receive no answer back, and they won't for the rest of the day. So just 1 minute after that, 8:14, the flight is hijacked. Waleed and Wael Shari rise from their seats, 2A, 2B, and they stab 2 flight attendants right off the bat. Atta rises from seat 8D and approaches the cockpit. And within minutes, we know that he's at the controls. We don't know if the pilots are dead at this point. Don't know exactly how he got in there. They may have just brute forced it. The doors of the day were not the fortified doors that they are now that you see. They could have just gotten a cockpit key from one of the flight attendants they stabbed. It's really unclear, and I guess it doesn't really matter. So a little wrinkle to this is seated right behind them is a guy named Daniel Lewin. And the reason this is important is because Daniel Lewin is an ex-officer in the Israeli Special Forces. And he obviously takes offense to the flight he's on being hijacked. We don't know what happened, but he is most likely grabbed from behind and stabbed by Atam al-Sakami, who's seated behind him. And I just like to imagine, I don't know if I like to, but I want you to imagine how different this day could have been. It very easily could have been. This guy is Special Forces, Israeli Special Forces. That is no joke. That is on par with American Special Forces, one of the best in the world. And I know he's going up against more than one person here, but the odds are not so stacked against him, even though these guys have knives. But needless to say, they get lucky. It could have gone very differently for them. They had no idea that a guy of this physical caliber was going to be in their way. But they take him down. And I just, it's important to realize, and this happens a lot through this story, how close this was. We talked about it in episode 1, the security screenings, even though the security of that time was a lot more lax than the security of today, how close and how these guys were scrutinized and how they were setting off red flags, all the way through, all the way up until they're hijacking the planes, they're getting almost stopped. Almost there. I mean, what more could you ask for besides a full, crew of soldiers? As a special forces guy right there in first class. But it just doesn't work out that way. So 8:19, and we're 6 minutes after the last routine communication from the pilots. And a flight attendant, her name's Betty Ong, and she spends a lot of time on the phone between the hijacking and when the plane eventually crashes into the World Trade Center. So she's on the phone with American Airlines. And here's her quote, "The cockpit is not answering. Somebody's stabbed in business class, and I think there's mace, that we can't breathe. I don't know. I think we're getting hijacked," unquote. She goes on to relay that 2 flight attendants have already been stabbed. And, Betty spends a lot of time on the phone relaying pretty critical information. And the problem is, I'm going to harp on throughout this, is we'll find out, is that there just isn't time. The system just is not ready to handle this. Nothing she could have done could have stopped what happened. We think about if Lewin had been able to overpower these guys and maybe stop this plane from crashing, or at least crashing into the World Trade Center, how different things would have been. But none of that would have stopped the other planes. So we go to 8:20. This is 1 minute after Betty is making her first call. FAA's Boston Center flight controllers decide that Flight 11 has probably been hijacked. 1 minute after that, 8:21, Flight 11's transponder signals turned off. We know that this was part of the plan. Atta and his group do that, but it can still be tracked via primary radar by Boston Center. And important to note, prior to the 9/11 Commission report, News organizations reported this time as 8:13 or immediately thereafter. That's since been proven to be untrue. And obviously that was probably just, they knew that's what time the flight had its last communication, but we have a better timeline now. So anyway, 3 minutes later, 8:24, radio transmission comes through from Flight 11. Quote, we have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport, unquote. Now it's believed that this is Atta mistakenly held a button directing his voice to the radio rather than the plane's cabin as he intended. He wanted to make that statement to the people in the plane. And as we'll find out, similar things were said on other planes. Part of the plan, keep people quiet. Obviously if they know their plane's going to be run into a building, they're all going to pull a Flight 93 and try to take this thing over. So a few seconds later, Atta's voice comes back on again. Quote, nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any moves, you'll endanger yourself and the plane. Just stay quiet, unquote. And air traffic control in Boston is hearing this transmission. So obviously at this point, they know for sure. So 8:25, 1 minute later, Boston Center flight controllers alert other flight control centers regarding Flight 11. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, also known as NORAD, is not yet alerted. So we're 12 minutes in to the hijacking, 11 minutes in. NORAD still doesn't know, but that's not a lot of time. So a minute and a half later, 8:26 and 30 seconds, Flight 11 makes a 100-degree turn south and heads for New York City. Let's fast forward. That's 7.5 minutes, 8:34. The third transmission from Flight 11. Again, this is Atta thinking he's saying this to the cabin. He's really saying it over the radio. Quote, nobody move, please. We are going back to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves, unquote. That same time, Boston Center notifies the tower controller at Otis Air National Guard Base in Cape Cod the flight has been hijacked. A few things go back and forth, but at this time, 2 F-15 pilots begin to suit up. 4 minutes later, and we know this time exactly, 8:37 and 52 seconds, Boston Center Control notifies NEADS, which is like the northeastern part of NORAD. The flight's been hijacked. The first notification received by NORAD that a flight has been hijacked. So we are, let me do the quick math here, almost 24 minutes into it, and NORAD now knows that they have a hijacked plane. The controller requests military help to intercept the jetliner. 8:41, so we are 3 minutes after that. FAA's New York Center requests information about Flight 11 over the radio. And here, this is where it gets a little weird, and we'll talk about Flight 175 next. Flight 175 responds, quote, we heard suspicious transmission on our departure out of Boston with someone, sound like someone keyed the mic and said, everyone stay in your seats, unquote. New York Center acknowledges and says it will pass the information on. 3 minutes after that, 8:44, flight attendant Amy Sweeney, also aboard Flight 11, working with Betty Ong, reports by telephone to Michael Woodward at American Airlines Flight Services office in Dallas, quote, something is wrong. We are in rapid descent. We are all over the place, unquote. A minute later, Woodward asks her, quote, describe what you see out of the window, unquote. She responds, quote, I see the water, I see the buildings, I see buildings, unquote. After a short pause, she reports, quote, we are flying low. We are flying very, very low. We are flying way too low, unquote. Seconds later, guys, I'm warning you, this is where my skin starts to crawl reading this. Seconds later, quote, oh my God, we are way too low, unquote. The call ends with a burst of very loud static. At 8:46, 2 F-15 fighter jets are ordered to scramble from Otis Air National Guard Base in Massachusetts, and they were intended to intercept Flight 11. But because Flight 11's transponder is off, the pilots don't know the location of their target. NEADS spends the next several minutes watching their radar screens in anticipation, just waiting for Flight 11 to return radar contact. But it never does. So at 8:46 and 40 seconds, Flight 11 crashes at roughly 466 miles per hour into the north face of the North Tower of the World Trade Center, somewhere between floors 93 and 99. The plane actually enters the tower intact, plows into the building's core, severing all the gypsum-encased stairwells, dragging all that flaming wreckage with it, and a powerful shockwave travels down to the ground and up again. The combustibles, the remnants of the aircraft, they all start on fire. That's more burning fuel. And important to note, these buildings lacked a traditional full cage frame, and that depends almost entirely on the strength of a narrow structural core running up the center. Fire at the center of the impact zone is in a position to compromise the integrity of all the columns, and people below the stairwells start to evacuate right away. But because of this, nobody above the impact zone is able to do that. Just a quick one here from BBC correspondent Stephen Evans. He was sitting in the foyer of the South Tower, and he described hearing, quote, a huge bang like someone dropped a skip full of rubbish. He's British, unquote. He says it's followed by 2 or 3 similar huge explosions. The South Tower shook when this happened. French filmmakers Jules and Getty and Nade and Czech immigrant Pavel Hlava, they videotaped the crash of Flight 11 with their cameras from different locations. And some other TV cameras recorded the sound, but not the image of the crash. So, right after this, the chief of the New York City Fire Department's 1st Battalion, Joseph Pfeiffer, makes the first fire department radio message advising that the Manhattan Fire Dispatch Office what had happened. Chief Pfeiffer and the personnel from the other companies were several blocks north of the corner. And so as that's happening, almost the same exact thing is happening on Flight 175. So United Airlines Flight 175 scheduled to depart from LA at 8 a.m. It's captained by a man named Victor Siricini. First Officer Michael Horrocks were the pilots. There's 7 flight attendants, 56 people on board. Flight 175 departs from Logan International Airport in Boston at 8:14. By 8:33, a little over 15 minutes later, it's at cruising altitude, 31,000 feet. Flight attendants are beginning cabin service, and the flight had taken off just as American Airlines Flight 11 was being hijacked. And at 8:42, United 175 flight crew completes their report on the suspicious transmission, overheard from another plane, which turned out to have been Flight 11. This is just after takeoff. So this is United 175's last communication with the ground. The hijackers, we know, attacked sometime between 8:42 and 8:46. They used knives, mace, they threatened that they had a bomb, they stabbed members of the flight crew, and both pilots are killed. Eyewitness accounts came from calls made from the rear of the plane from passengers originally seated further forward in the cabin. And this is taken as a sign that the passengers, perhaps the crew, had been moved to the back of the aircraft. And given the similarities to American Flight 11 in hijacker seating and eyewitness reports of tactics, and the weapons, as well as contact between the presumed team leaders, Atta and Shahi, it's really universally believed the tactics were similar on both flights. And it's important to note, this is just 4 minutes, right? In this span of 4 minutes, they take over the plane, they kill the pilots, they have all the passengers in the back, they have complete control of this flight. The first kind of operational evidence that something was abnormal on Flight 175 came at about 8:47. Aircraft changed beacon codes twice within a minute. At 8:51, the flight deviated from its assigned altitude, and a minute later, New York air traffic controllers began repeatedly trying to contact it. No success. At 8:52, in Easton, Connecticut, a man named Lee Hansen received a phone call from his son, Peter, who was a passenger on Flight 175. His son tells him, quote, "I think they've taken over the cockpit. An attendant has been stabbed, and someone else's up front may have been killed. The plane is making strange moves. Call United Airlines. Tell them it's Flight 175, Boston to LA." Unquote. Lee Hansen calls his local police department and relays what he's just heard. Also at 8:52, male flight attendant called the United office in San Francisco, reaching a guy named Mark Palacastro. The flight attendant reported the flight had been hijacked, both pilots had been killed, and a flight attendant had been stabbed, and the hijackers were probably flying the plane. The last call lasted about 2 minutes, after which Palacastro and a colleague tried unsuccessfully to contact the flight. At 8:58, the flight took a heading toward New York City, and at 8:59, Flight 175 passenger, a man named Brian David Sweeney, tries to call his wife. He left a message on their home answering machine that the plane had been hijacked. Then he called his mother, Louise, told her the flight had been hijacked, and added the passengers were thinking about storming the cockpit to take control of the plane. 9 o'clock, Lee Hansen, the guy that got the call from his son Peter, gets another call from him. And he says, quote, "It's getting bad, Dad. Stewardess was stabbed. They seem to have knives and mace. They said they have a bomb. It's getting very bad on the plane. Passengers are throwing up and getting sick. Plane's making jerky movements. I don't think the pilot is flying the plane. I think we're going down. I think they intended to go to Chicago or someplace and fly it into a building. Don't worry, Dad. If it happens, it'll be very fast. My God, my God." Unquote. The call ends abruptly. Lee Hansen says he heard a woman scream just before it cut off. He turned on a television, and in her home, so does Louise Sweeney, the person who got the other call, and they saw the second aircraft hit the World Trade Center. At 9:03 and 11 seconds, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center. All on board, along with an unknown number of people in the tower, were killed instantly. And now we're on to American Airlines Flight 77, which was scheduled to depart from Washington Dulles for Los Angeles at 8:10. And you'll notice these planes are all loaded to go cross-country. That's on purpose. Big planes, lots of gasoline on them. Or I should say jet fuel. So American Airlines Flight 77, this is piloted by Captain Charles Burlingame, First Officer David Charleboy. There are 4 flight attendants. Flight carried 58 passengers, and this flight takes off at 8:20. At 8:46, the flight reaches cruising altitude. Cabin service has begun. At 8:51, American Airlines Flight 77 transmits its last routine communication. Hijacking happens between 8:51 and 8:54. Again, notice how fast these are happening. That's 3 minutes. And as on American 11 and United 175, the hijackers used knives. They moved all the passengers to the rear of the aircraft. Unlike earlier flights, Flight 77 hijackers are reported to have box cutters. And finally, a passenger reported that an announcement had been made by the, quote, pilot that the plane had been hijacked. Neither of the first-hand accounts mentioned any stabbings or threat or use of either a bomb or mace, though both witnesses began the flight in the first-class cabin. At 8:54, the aircraft deviated from its assigned course, turned south. 2 minutes later, the transponder turns off, and even the primary radar contact when the aircraft is lost. Indianapolis Air Traffic Control Center repeatedly tried and failed to contact the aircraft. American Airlines dispatchers also tried without success. At 9 a.m., American Airlines Executive Vice President Gerard Arpev learned that communications had been lost with Flight 77. This is now the second American aircraft that's in trouble. He ordered all American airline flights in the Northeast that had not taken off to remain on the ground shortly before 9:10, suspecting that 77 had been hijacked. American Airlines headquarters concluded that the second aircraft to hit the World Trade Center might have been Flight 77. After learning United Airlines was missing a plane, American Airlines headquarters extended the ground stop nationwide. So at 9:12, Renee May calls her mother, Nancy May, in Las Vegas. She said her flight's been hijacked by 6 individuals who had moved them to the rear of the plane. She asked her mother to alert American Airlines. Nancy May and her husband promptly did so. At some point between 9:16 and 9:26 a.m., Barbara Olson calls her husband, Ted Olson, Solicitor General of the United States. She reported that the flight had been hijacked. The hijackers and knives had knives and box cutters. She further indicated the hijackers were not aware of her phone call and that they had put all the passengers in the back of the plane. About a minute into the conversation, the call is cut off. Solicitor General Olson tries unsuccessfully to reach the Attorney General, who at the time is John Ashcroft. Shortly after the first call, Barbara Olson reached her husband again. She reported that the pilot had announced that the flight had been hijacked. She asks her husband what she should tell the captain to do. Ted Olson asked for her location, replies the aircraft has been flying over houses. Another passenger told her they were traveling northeast. Solicitor General then informs his wife of the 2 previous hijackings and crashes. She does not, at this time, display any signs of panic, did not indicate any awareness of any impending crash. At that point, that call is cut off. At 9:29, the autopilot on American Flight 77 is disengaged. The aircraft is at 7,000 feet, approximately 38 miles west of the Pentagon. At 9:32, controllers at Dulles Terminal Radar Approach Control, quote, observe a primary radar target tracking eastbound at a high rate of speed, unquote. This is later determined to be Flight 77. At 9:34, Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport advised the Secret Service of an unknown aircraft heading in the direction of the White House. American Flight 77 was then 5 miles west of the Pentagon and began a 330-degree turn. At the end of the turn, it was descending through 2,200 feet, pointing toward the Pentagon and downtown Washington. The hijacker pilot then advanced the throttles to maximum power and dove toward the Pentagon. At 9:37 and 46 seconds, American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, traveling at approximately 530 miles per hour. All on board, as well as many civilian and military personnel in the building, were killed. And finally, we're going to get to United Flight 93, which is much different in terms of how things happen. You may have heard through the years about the battle for United 93. That's actually what they call it in the 9/11 Commission report. There's a famous movie about this. I'd recommend it. And it's pretty intense. So here we go. 8:42 a.m. United Flight 93 takes off from Newark, New Jersey, bound for San Francisco. Again, cross-country flight, loaded up with jet fuel. Aircraft's piloted by Captain Jason Dahl, First Officer Leroy Homer, and there are 5 flight attendants. There's 37 passengers, including the hijackers, on this plane. Takeoff was delayed because the airport had typically heavy morning traffic, and the hijackers had planned to take flights scheduled to depart at 7:45. American 11, 8 o'clock, United 175, United 93, and 8:10, American 77. 3 of the flights had actually taken off within 10 to 15 minutes of their planned times. United 93 ordinarily would have taken off about 15 minutes after pulling away from the gate. But when it left the ground at 8:42, the flight was running more than 25 minutes late. As United 93 left Newark, the flight's crew members were unaware of the hijacking of American 11. 9 o'clock, the FAA, American, and United were facing the staggering realization, and that's direct from the report, staggering realization. You can just imagine as it came over these people, these operations people, what was happening. They have the staggering realization of the apparent multiple hijackings. At 9:03, they would see another aircraft strike the World Trade Center. Crisis managers at the FAA and the airlines did not yet act to warn the other aircraft. At the same time, Boston Center realized the message transmitted just before 8:25 by the hijacker of American 11 included the phrase, quote, "we have some planes," unquote. And it's important to note, even in the 9/11 Commission report, that phrase, "we have some planes," is like a chapter title. I mean, that's when they know, and that's what tells you this is bad, this is coordinated. And no one at the FAA or the airlines that day had ever dealt with a multiple hijacking scenario. Such a plot had never been carried out anywhere in the world in more than 30 years, and never, ever in the United States. So as news of the hijackings filtered through the FAA and the airlines, it does not seem to have occurred to them at their leadership that they needed to alert other aircraft in the air that they might too be at risk. So United 175 was hijacked between 8:42 and 8:46. Awareness of that hijacking began to spread at about 8:51. American 77 is hijacked between 8:51 and 8:54, and by 9 a.m., FAA and airline officials begin to comprehend that the attackers were going after multiple aircraft. American Airlines nationwide grounds all its planes between 9:05 and 9:10. This is followed by United Airlines ground stop. FAA controllers at Boston Center, which had tracked the first 2 hijackings, requested at 9:07 a.m. that Herndon Command Center, quote, "get the messages to airborne aircraft to increase security for the cockpit, unquote. But there's no evidence that Herndon took such action. Boston Center immediately began speculating about other aircraft that might be in danger, leading to worry about transcontinental flight Delta 1989. And that flight was in fact not hijacked. But at 9:19, the FAA's New England Regional Office called Herndon and asked Cleveland Center to advise Delta 1989 to use extra cockpit security. Several FAA air traffic control officials told us, they tell the people that made the 9/11 Commission report that it was the air carrier's responsibility to notify their planes of security problems. And one senior FAA air traffic controller said it was simply not the FAA's place to order the airlines what to tell their pilots. In this context, at this time, and the way things were happening, and remember, none of this had happened yet, right? At the time, airlines bore responsibility to do this. And there was a playbook, but not really a playbook for this. And so the airlines bore responsibility. They're facing an escalated number of conflicting, and for the most part, erroneous reports about other flights, as well as continued lack of vital information from the FAA about the hijacked flights that had already happened. So no evidence was found, however, that American Airlines sent any cockpit warnings to its aircraft on 9/11. United Airlines' first decisive action to notify its airborne aircraft to take defensive action did not come until 9/19, where United flight dispatcher Al Bollinger took the initiative to begin transmitting warnings to his 16 transcontinental flights. So by all accounts, the first 46 minutes of Flight 93's cross-country trip proceeded routinely. Radio communications from the plane were normal. Heading, speed, altitude ran according to plan. And at 9:24, Bollinger's warning to United 93 was received in the cockpit. Within 2 minutes, at 9:26, the pilot, Jason Dahl, responded with a note of puzzlement. Quote, Ed, confirm the last message, unquote. The hijackers attacked at 9:28 while traveling about 35,000 feet above eastern Ohio. Right away, United 93 suddenly drops 700 feet. 11 seconds into that descent, the FAA's Air Traffic Control Center in Cleveland received its first two-way radio transmission from the aircraft. During the first broadcast, the captain, first officer, could be heard declaring Mayday amid the sounds of a physical struggle in the cockpit. Second radio transmission, 35 seconds later, indicated the flight was continuing. The captain, or the first officer, they don't know which, could be heard shouting, quote, hey, get out of here, get out of here, get out of here, unquote. On the morning of 9/11, there were only 37 passengers on United 93. That's 33 in addition to the hijackers. This was below the normal for a Tuesday morning at the time. But there's no evidence that the hijackers manipulated passenger levels, purchased additional seats to facilitate their operation. The terrorists who hijacked the three other commercial flights on 9/11 operated in five-man teams. They initiated their cockpit takeovers within 30 minutes. Flight 93, however, is different. It took place 46 minutes after takeoff, and there were only 4 hijackers. The operative, likely intended to round out the team for this first flight, Mohammed al-Qahtani, had been refused entry by a suspicious immigration inspector in Orlando in August. Because several passengers on United 93 described 3 hijackers on the plane, not 4, some of you wondered whether one of the hijackers had been able to use the cockpit jump seat from the outset of the flight. FAA rules allow the use of the seat by documented and approved individuals, usually air carrier or FAA personnel. But it's important to note that they found no evidence indicating that any of the hijackers or anyone else sat there on this flight. All the hijackers had assigned seats in first class, and they seemed to have used them. It's probably more likely that Jarrah, the crucial, pilot-trained member of this team, remained seated and inconspicuous till after the cockpit was seized. And once he was inside, he would not have been visible to the passengers. At 9:32, a hijacker, most likely Jarrah, made or attempted the following announcement to the passengers of Flight 93. Ladies and gentlemen, here the captain. Please sit down and keep remaining sitting. We have a bomb on board, so sit. The flight data recorder, which was recovered in this flight, indicates that Jarrah then instructed the plane's autopilot to turn the aircraft around and head east. The cockpit voice recorder data indicate that a woman, most likely a flight attendant, was being held captive in the cockpit. She struggled with one of the hijackers who killed or silenced her in some way. Shortly thereafter, the passengers and the flight crew began a series of calls from the airphones and cell phones. These calls between family, friends, colleagues took place until the end of the flight and provided those on the ground with first-hand accounts. This really enabled the passengers to gain the critical information they needed, including the news that 2 aircraft had already slammed into the World Trade Center. This is a big difference. They know what's likely happening and what the point of all this is. So at 9:39, FAA's Cleveland Air Route Traffic Control Center overheard the second announcement indicating there was a bomb on board. The plane was returning to the airport and that they should remain seated. Well, apparently it was not heard by the passengers. This announcement, like those on Flight 11 and Flight 77, was intended to deceive them. Jarrah, like Atta earlier, may have inadvertently broadcast the message because he did not know how to operate the radio and the intercom. To our knowledge, none of them had actually flown an actual airliner before. So at least 2 callers from the flight reported that the hijackers knew the passengers were making calls, but did not really care. It's quite possible Jarrah knew of the success of the assault on the World Trade Center. He could have learned of this from messages being sent by United Airlines to the cockpits of the other flights, including 93, warning of cockpit intrusion, telling of the New York attacks. But even without them, he certainly would have understood that the attacks on the World Trade Center would have already happened, given that they had taken so long to take off and that they've been delayed. If Jarrah did know that the passengers were making calls, it might not have occurred to him that they were certain to learn what had happened in New York, and therefore changing the chessboard for him. At least 10 passengers and 2 crew members shared vital information with family, friends, colleagues, or others on the ground. All understood the plane had been hijacked. They said the hijackers wielded knives, claimed to have a bomb. The hijackers were wearing red bandanas, and they forced the passengers to the back of the aircraft. Callers reported the passenger had been stabbed. 2 people were lying on the floor of the cabin, injured or dead, possibly the captain and the first officer. 1 caller reports the flight attendant had been killed. One of the callers from United 93 also reports that he thought the hijackers might possess a gun. But it's now believed that there was never a gun. During at least 5 of these passenger phone calls, information was shared about the attacks that had occurred earlier that morning on the World Trade Center. 5 calls described the intent of the passengers and surviving crew members to revolt against the hijackers. According to 1 call, they voted on whether to rush the terrorists in an attempt to retake the plane. And as we all know, they did decide to do this, and they acted. At 9:57 a.m., the passenger assault begins on the hijackers. Several passengers had terminated phone calls with loved ones in order to join. One of the callers ended her message as follows: "Everyone's running up to first class. I've got to go. Bye." The cockpit voice recorder captured the sounds of the passenger assault, muffled by the intervening cockpit door. In response, Jarrah immediately began to roll the airplane to the left and right, attempting to knock the passengers off balance. At 9:58 and 57 seconds, Jarrah told another hijacker in the cockpit to block the door. Jarrah continued to roll the airplane sharply left and right, but the assault continued. These passengers, they knew what was going to happen, and they didn't give up. At 9:59 and 52 seconds, Jarrah changed tactics, pitched the nose of the airplane up and down to disrupt the assault. The recorder captured the sounds of loud thumps, crashes, shouts, breaking glass. 10 a.m. and 3 seconds, Jarrah stabilizes the airplane. 5 seconds later, Jarrah asked, quote, "Is that it? Shall we finish it off?" unquote. One of the other hijackers responds, "No, not yet. When they all come, we finish it off." The sounds of the fighting continued outside the cockpit. Again, Jarrah pitched the nose of the aircraft up and down. At 10 o'clock 26 seconds, a passenger in the background said, quote, "In the cockpit, if we don't, we'll die," unquote. 16 seconds later, a passenger yelled, "Roll it." Jarrah stopped the violent maneuvers at about 10:01 and said, quote, "Allah is the greatest. Allah is the greatest," unquote. Then he asked another hijacker in the cockpit, "Is that it? I mean, shall we put it down?" To which the other replied, "Yes. Put it in it, pull it down." The passengers continued their assault anyway. 10:02 and 23 seconds, a hijacker says, "Pull it down, pull it down." The hijackers remained at the controls, but must have judged that the passengers were only seconds from overcoming them. Airplane headed down. The control wheel was turned hard right. The airplane rolled onto its back. One of the hijackers began shouting, "Allah is the greatest! Allah is the greatest!" with the sounds of the passenger counterattack continuing. Aircraft plowed into an empty field, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, 580 miles per hour. About 20 minutes flying time from Washington, D.C. Giroux's objective was to crash his airliner into the symbols of American Republic, the Capitol, or the White House. But in the end, he was defeated by these unarmed passengers of Flight 93. And that, I believe, is a good place to stop. Oof, that is a lot. It's a lot of intensity, and it's a lot of information. And as you can probably tell, or if you haven't figured out, a lot of these timelines are specifically brought together in a lot of places. There's the 9/11 Commission report. Some very diligent people on the internet have put together, second by second timelines, and I'm following a lot of that. And a lot of times I'm reading, directly from these official documents, and then kind of adding my own flavor. And all this is available to you, by the way. The 9/11 Commission report is free online. It's a PDF. There is obviously information all over the internet. There's tons of books. You could spend days and days and days just reading the Wikipedia timelines on this stuff. It's a lot, and that's probably a good place to stop for this episode. I think what we'll do for the final one is do kind of a minute by minute of the response. Starting at like 9 a.m., President Bush entering a classroom all the way till that night, because a lot of crazy stuff happens, and it's very surreal and eerie to kind of see it from the coverage standpoint, to hear what the firefighters were doing, to hear what, the president was doing, the vice president, the military, how the news was reporting it. It's really surreal. So that'll be the third installment of the 9/11 attacks. So once again, thank you so much for listening. I know it's been a really long time between the first and the second episode, but it will not be nearly as long between the second and the third. So thanks again, and have a good one.